I stared at the polished marble floor of the bank, my hands clenched so tight the scars across my knuckles turned white. The branch manager, a man in a suit that cost more than my first rig, was sneering as he pushed my veteran's ID back across the counter like it was a piece of trash. "We don't handle special requests from people like you," he drawled, his voice loud enough to make the entire lobby go silent. I felt the heat rising in my chest, that old familiar hum of a storm about to break, but I stayed quiet. Then the heavy glass doors hissed open, and the air in the room suddenly went cold. A man in a 4-star uniform stepped in, his eyes locking onto mine, and before the manager could utter another insult, the general barked a single order that saw every exit in the building slam shut and lock. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the neon signs of the truck stop into smears of red and blue, casting a lonely glow over the asphalt. I sat in the cab of my Peterbilt, the engine idling with a low rhythmic thrum, the heartbeat of a long-haul life. But tonight, the air felt heavy, charged with the kind of static that precedes a lightning strike. I'd spent 14 hours on the I-80, dodging black ice and four-wheelers who thought they were invincible, and all I wanted was to deposit my hauling check and find a corner of the world where nobody needed anything from me. I'm Jack Mercer, though most folks on the CB know me as Redline. I've spent half my life behind this wheel and the other half in boots I'm not allowed to talk about much. I try to stay in my lane. I mind my business, keep my logs straight and don't go looking for trouble, but sometimes trouble has a way of spotting a trucker's plates from a mile out. I climbed out of the cab, the cold wind biting through my flannel shirt. My knee popped, a souvenir from a ditch in Fallujah, and I limped slightly as I crossed the lot toward the local branch. I needed this deposit to go through. My daughter's tuition was due, and the line was thin this month. Every step toward that brick-and-mortar building felt like walking back into a world that didn't want me, a world that preferred its heroes on posters rather than in the mud. When I walked into the bank, the atmosphere was sterile and smelled of expensive floor wax and old money. I took my place in line, feeling out of place in my grease-stained jeans and work boots. That's when I saw her. A young woman, maybe 21, standing at the teller window. She was trembling, her eyes red-rimmed and darting toward a man standing near the door. He was wearing a leather jacket, leaning against a pillar with a look of pure, predatory confidence. He wasn't looking at the vault. He was looking at her like she was property. I watched. I didn't move. I've learned that intervening too early just makes things messy, and I was trying to be the man my daughter thinks I am, the quiet one. But then I heard it. The man in the leather jacket hissed something to her, a threat that made her flinch so hard she dropped her pen. The bank manager, a tall, thin man named Mr. Sterling, didn't check on her. Instead, he walked over to the man in the leather jacket, shook his hand, and pointed at the girl. They were laughing, a cruel, shared joke at the expense of someone who couldn't fight back. "Next!" Sterling called out, his voice dripping with forced professional courtesy. I stepped up, my boots thudding heavy on the marble. I didn't want a scene. I just handed him my check and my veteran's ID for verification. He didn't even look at the check. He picked up my ID with 2 fingers, squinting at the symbol of my service as if it were a counterfeit coupon. "Mercer," he read aloud, his voice carrying through the quiet lobby. "Another one looking for a handout? We've had 3 of you heroes in here today trying to leverage old stories for credit extensions. It's pathetic, really." The man in the leather jacket, the girl's husband or ex, the kind of bully who grows in the shade of a bank manager's ego, walked over. "Trucker, huh?" he mocked, looking me up and down with a smirk. "Probably spends more time in bars than in the service. Look at him, Sterling, he's shaking." I wasn't shaking from fear. I was shaking because I was trying to keep the red line buried deep. The adrenaline was starting to pool in my stomach, that cold, familiar weight. "I just want to deposit the check, sir," I said, my voice low and steady, the calm before the gale. Well, I don't like your tone, Sterling said, leaning forward until I could smell the peppermint on his breath. He threw the ID back at me. It slid off the marble counter and hit the floor with a plastic click. And I don't like people like you intimidating my staff. Leave, now, before I have you removed. The situation shifted then, an irreversible change. The man in the leather jacket reached over the low partition and grabbed the girl's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. She let out a small, choked sob. Come on, Sarah. We're done here. Mr. Sterling says we're taking that emergency fund today. He was robbing her, not with a mask, but with the manager's blessing and a legal technicality. I looked at the exit, then at the girl's terrified eyes. If I walked out, I was just another ghost on the road. If I stayed, everything changed. I stayed. As the man tried to drag her toward the side exit, I stepped into his path, blocking the only route out of that corner. I'm not a small man, and when I plant my feet, I'm an anchor in a storm. He slammed into my chest and recoiled like he'd hit the grill of a semi-truck. Step away from her, I said, my voice dropping an octave. Get out of the way, old man, he roared, swinging a wild, desperate right hook. I didn't dodge it. I redirected it. I caught his wrist mid-air, used his own momentum to twist his arm, and sent him face first into the heavy mahogany writing desk in the center of the lobby. The sound of his nose breaking was a dull thud that echoed in the high ceilings. He bounced off the wood, blood already staining the polished surface. You're dead, he screamed, his hand diving into his jacket for something heavy and metallic. I didn't give him the chance to draw. I closed the distance in 2 steps, my hand clamping down on his wrist like a vice before he could clear leather. I drove my knee into his midsection, a clinical strike that collapsed his lungs and forced the air out in a ragged wheeze. I spun him around, pinning his arm behind his back in a high-tension lock that had him whimpering on his knees. Call the police! Sterling was screaming, his face a mask of purple rage as he realized he'd lost control of his lobby. This trucker is attacking a client. He's a maniac. Someone help! The man in my grip was struggling, kicking back at my shins with steel-toed boots. I didn't budge. I increased the pressure on his shoulder, feeling the joint reach its limit. I wasn't just holding a bully. I was holding back a decade of being ignored. He's hurting her, Sterling, I growled, my eyes never leaving the manager's. And you're handing him the leash. I'm the manager here, Sterling yelled, grabbing a heavy brass paperweight from the desk and lunging at me in a fit of cowardly bravado. I had to let go of the first guy to deal with the new threat. I stepped inside Sterling's reach, caught his arm, and applied a pressure point that made him drop the brass with a clang. I sent him sprawling back into his own plush chair, which skidded across the marble. The guy in the leather jacket saw his opening and lunged for the girl again, trying to use her as a shield. I was faster. I delivered a sharp side kick to his thigh that sent his leg buckling, then grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and slammed him against the thick glass front of the bank. The glass didn't break, but the vibration was a low, bone-shaking hum. I kept him pinned there, his face pressed against the transparent barrier while the world outside watched. I told you, I whispered, the words vibrating through his skull, to step away. Suddenly the front doors didn't just open. They exploded inward as the security locks were overridden from the outside. 4 black SUVs screeched to a halt on the sidewalk, mounting the curb to block the street. A dozen men in tactical gear swarmed the entrance, but they weren't the local PD. A man in a crisp army service uniform stepped out of the lead vehicle, his medals catching the dim banklight. General Harrison. The man I'd pulled out of a burning wreckage in the middle of a desert when the world was on fire 10 years ago. He walked into the bank, his boots clicking with a rhythm that silenced the room. He didn't look at the chaos. He didn't look at the blood on the desk. He looked straight at me, through the years and the grime of the road. Sterling scrambled to his feet, trying to regain his dignity. General, thank God. This veteran, this trucker, he's assaulted us. He's a danger to society. Look at what he's done. General Harrison didn't even acknowledge Sterling existed. He looked at the man I was still holding against the glass, then at the girl, who was shaking behind the counter like a leaf in a gale. "Lock the doors," the general said, his voice a quiet boom. One of his aides hit a remote, and the heavy security shutters began to roll down, sealing the lobby from the street, turning the bank into a tomb for a manager's career. "What is this?" Sterling stammered, his voice climbing an octave. "You can't do this. This is a private institution." "I can do a lot of things, Mr. Sterling," the general said, stepping into the center of the lobby. "Starting with asking why you are speaking to a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient with such disrespect." The room went dead silent. The man in my grip stopped struggling, his body going limp as the weight of who I was finally sank in. I looked at the general, then at my own scarred hands, still holding the villain by the throat. The silence in that lobby was so thick you could have felt it through a pair of work gloves. I let go of the man in the leather jacket, and he slid down the glass like a discarded rag, his eyes fixed on the rows of ribbons on the general's chest. Sterling looked like he'd swallowed a gallon of bad diesel, his face turning a sickly shade of grey as he realized the old trucker he'd been mocking was standing in the center of a military operation. "Medal of Honor?" Sterling's voice cracked, sounding small and hollow in the vastness of the marble lobby. He looked at my grease-stained flannel, then back at the general, his mind clearly unable to bridge the gap between a long-haul driver and a national hero. "But he's just a driver. He's a nobody. He's the man who walked into a live fire zone to pull my staff car out of a ditch, while the rest of the world was running the other way," the general said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. "And I've spent 10 years trying to find him because he disappeared the day he got his discharge papers. Now, I find him in a small-town bank being treated like a criminal by a man who couldn't carry his rucksack." "None." The man on the floor, Sarah's ex, tried to scramble toward the side door, but one of the tactical team members stepped into his path, his rifle held across his chest in a low, ready position. The bully froze, his predatory confidence evaporating as he realized the exits weren't just blocked, they were occupied by people who didn't care about his local influence. "Jack," the general said, turning to me, his eyes searching mine for the man I used to be. "Tell me what's happening here." "Dus," I took a breath, feeling the adrenaline start to level out into a cold, hard clarity that I hadn't felt since my last tour. "This man," I said, pointing to the one on the floor, who was now bleeding onto the expensive floor wax, "was using his relationship with the manager to illegally seize funds from that young woman. She was terrified, and the system was being rigged to make sure she stayed that way. When I stepped in, they both decided my service didn't mean as much as their bottom line." "Is that right, Mr. Sterling?" Harrison asked, stepping closer to the desk, his presence filling the room with an authority that Sterling could never hope to mimic. Sterling was shaking now, his hands fumbling with the papers on his desk, trying to hide the evidence of his own greed. "It was a civil matter, a dispute over a joint account. I was just following protocol. The protocol involves letting a man physically assault a teller." I stepped forward, my boots thudding heavy on the marble, and Sterling flinched so hard he nearly tipped his chair. "I saw you nod to him. I saw you give him the green light to take her out of here against her will while you looked the other way." The general looked at the girl, Sarah. "Ma'am, is this true?" She nodded, tears finally spilling over, her hands clutching the edge of the counter until her knuckles were white. "He told me if I didn't sign the papers, he'd make sure I never saw my daughter again, and Mr. Sterling said he'd back him up in court." The air in the room changed again. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was lethal. The injustice of it all, the way they used their power to crush someone who already had nothing, it burned in my gut. "Secure them!" the general ordered, his voice like a gavel. The man in the leather jacket didn't go quietly. He saw a gap and lunged at the nearest soldier, a desperate, cornered rat move intended to create enough chaos to slip away. Before the soldier could even drop his shoulder, I was already moving. I caught the man by the collar, spun him around, and used his own weight to drive him into the marble floor with a bone-jarring slam that echoed like a gunshot. I pinned his arm behind his back, my knee anchored in the small of his spine, and I didn't let up until the heavy-duty zip ties clicked into place. "You're a trucker," the man screamed, his face pressed against the cold stone, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You're nothing. You're just a low-life driver." "I'm a man who knows exactly what you are," I said, my voice barely a whisper against his ear, cold enough to freeze the blood in his veins. "And I'm the man who's going to make sure you never get close to that girl again." Sterling tried to make a break for his private office, likely to shred whatever records of this deal he had left, but Harrison's men were faster. They intercepted him at the door, catching him by the arms and escorting him back to the center of the lobby. The general looked at me, a small, grim smile touching his lips, the look of a man who recognized a brother in arms regardless of the clothes he wore. "You still got the hands, Mercer," he said, nodding toward the man I'd just subdued, "even after all these years on the road." "You never really lose it, sir," I replied, wiping a smear of blood from my knuckle with my thumb. "You just try to find a place where you don't have to use it." The local police arrived 10 minutes later, their sirens wailing outside the heavy security shutters, a chaotic contrast to the silence we'd established inside. When the general opened the doors, the local chief started to bark orders, ready to take control of what he thought was a robbery. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the 4-star general standing in the lobby of his local bank, surrounded by elite tactical units. "Chief," Harrison said, his voice echoing through the building with the weight of a mountain, "I believe you have some paperwork to process. These 2 individuals have been involved in a conspiracy to commit kidnapping and financial fraud, and I have a dozen witnesses in tactical gear who saw it all." I watched as they led Sterling and the bully away in handcuffs. The manager was blubbering now, his career and his reputation dissolving in the rain outside. Sarah came around the counter, her face pale but her hands finally steady. She looked at me, then at the general, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile the man who'd saved her with the man who'd just walked in off the street. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but clear. "I didn't think anyone was going to help. I thought I was alone." "There's always someone watching, Sarah," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the crumpled deposit slip Sterling had ignored. "Sometimes they're just wearing flannel instead of a suit." The general walked me out to my rig, the rain finally letting up, leaving the air smelling of wet pavement and ozone. The headlights of the Peterbilt cut through the mist, a beacon in the grey afternoon. "I mean it, Jack," Harrison said, looking up at the towering chrome of the truck. "I've been looking for you for a reason. There's a position at the Pentagon, logistics, security oversight, things that need a man who knows how the world actually works on the ground. You shouldn't be hauling livestock and dry goods through the mud." I climbed up into the cab, the familiar smell of diesel, old coffee and leather wrapping around me like a worn-in blanket. I looked down at him, then out at the long, dark ribbon of the highway stretching toward the horizon, calling me back to the only life that made sense anymore. "I appreciate the offer, General," I said, turning the key and feeling the roar of the Cummins vibrate through my boots. "But I think I'll stick to the road. Out here I know exactly who the villains are, and they usually don't see me coming until it's way too late to apologize." I pulled the air horn, a blast that echoed off the bank's marble walls one last time, and put the rig in gear. As I pulled out of the lot, I could see the general in my mirror standing there in the rain, offering a slow, sharp salute to the back of a dirty trailer. I didn't salute back. I just shifted into 10th and headed for the state line. Another mile down, another story left in the rear view. The cab of the Peterbilt was quiet now, the only sound the soft tick of the cooling engine and the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement. I sat there for a long time, my hands still resting on the wheel, feeling the phantom heat of the adrenaline slowly receding from my veins. Out here on the edge of a nameless town, the world felt massive and indifferent. A sprawling map of shadows and light, where people like Sterling and that bully thought they could operate in the dark. They think the road is just a conveyor belt for goods, but they forget it's also a lifeline for those of us who have nowhere else to go. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, tattered envelope. Inside was a drawing my daughter had made years ago, a crude, colourful sketch of a big rig with a tiny stick figure in the driver's seat. I traced the lines with a thumb that was still bruised from the fight. I do this for her. I drive these miles so she can have the life I never did, a life where she doesn't have to look over her shoulder or wonder if the person behind the counter is a friend or a predator. I thought about Sarah. By now, she was probably home, holding her own child, feeling the incredible heavy relief of a threat finally lifted. She'd remember the general, and she'd remember the soldiers, but mostly, I hoped she'd remember that the world isn't as cold as it looks. Justice isn't always a courtroom or a gavel. Sometimes it's just a man who refuses to move out of the way. It's the quiet weight of a trucker's shield standing between a victim and the storm. My knee was throbbing, a deep, dull ache that reminded me I wasn't as young as I was when I pulled Harrison out of that wreck. I looked at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of my own eyes, tired, weathered, but still clear. The general's offer was tempting, a warm office, a steady paycheck, a title that people would respect. But as I looked out at the horizon, where the first hint of grey was starting to break the night, I knew I couldn't take it. The road is where I belong. It's the only place where the silence is honest. I'm not a hero on a pedestal, and I'm not a file in a government building. I'm just Jack Mercer. I'm the man who carries the freight, the man who watches the mirrors, and the man who steps in when the rest of the world turns a blind eye. I took a deep breath, the smell of rain and diesel filling my lungs, and for the first time in hours, the tension in my shoulders finally dissolved. I wasn't looking for a thank you, and I wasn't looking for a medal. The look in Sarah's eyes when the handcuffs clicked on that bully, that was all the payment I needed. I put the truck in gear, the low growl of the engine a familiar lullaby. There was another load waiting 300 miles south, another sunset to chase, and 1,000 more miles of blacktop to cover before I could rest. As the Peterbilt rolled out of the lot and onto the highway, I felt the familiar pull of the white lines, guiding me back into the world where I'm just another ghost in the machine. But I drove a little lighter tonight, knowing that for one person, the road had finally led home. Thank you for watching, and if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.